Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote, named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. On this podcast, we've often explored ideas of liberalism from the American founding and its principles to the future of the think tank. Go listen to those episodes. Today, on January 25th, 2023, I wanted to explore further this idea of liberalism and what it has, what it holds in store, what its future will look like with Robert Tracinski. He's the author of Symposium, which is a Substack and podcast about liberalism. He's the author of several books, and he writes his own Substack called The Tracinski Letter. He's also a columnist at Discourse Magazine. He's got a lot going on. We're going to look at questions like, what is liberalism and what are the threats to liberalism today? So without further ado, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
So I guess here's some further ado. What is the most important thing that people my age or my generation should know that we don't?
That's a good question. That's a really interesting question. Well, now, I'm not going to say I'm going to have the finger on the pulse of America's youth, but the big thing that I observe about young people is that above all else, the global warming claims have gotten them in this sort of dystopian, apocalyptic outlook that, oh my God, the whole world's messed up. Everything's, we're all doomed. There's this tremendous pessimism. And I think that has a lot of interesting knock-on effects. So, it's not just global warming. It's also things like I hear people say, oh, well, everything's been ruined. College is too expensive. We can't afford a house. Your generation had it so much better. My generation did not actually have it that much better. If you look at the numbers, I mean, things are actually improving. And in the, not just, from my, I'm a Gen Xer, not just from my generation, from the 1980s or 1990s to today, but also in the larger scheme of things, the whole history of the last 200 years is this tremendous explosion of wealth and opportunity, radiating out, with the Industrial Revolution, radiating out across the world, going down to the common man, especially in the most developed societies, that people have tremendous opportunities today that previous generations could not have dreamed of. And so this sort of pessimism is incredibly misplaced, but it also has these knock-on effects. And the main one I see is, there's been a couple discussions recently, just in the last really month or two, talking about how this idea there's a great stagnation, that we're not innovating as much as we used to. And part of the source of that, one of the reasons people are talking about that, is this dystopianism, this pessimism, that it makes people think, well, we can only talk about energy innovation, for example, in the context of, well, how can we get rid of our existing power supplies, replace them with renewable ones? How can we reduce our power use? How can we become more efficient? And not, how can we dramatically increase the amount of energy we're using? So, J. Storrs Hall had a book out recently called Where's My Flying Car? And he has what's called the Henry Adams curve. And it's this idea that, since the Industrial Revolution, the amount of energy use per capita has been increasing geometrically until about 1970, when it kind of levels off. And he's saying, well, what would be possible if we went back onto that geometric curve and we're using, 10 times more energy than we were 50 years ago? What would that look like? What would we be able to do? And I think that sense of possibility, of endless growth, of innovation, of we should be out building an amazing future. That's what's been lost in all of this sort of apocalyptic hysteria. That it's not the fault of young people. You've been raised with that, and it's people my age who've been shouting it at you for most of your lives. But I think that just so distorts the outlook that people have in terms of just what is even possible in life.
It's also, you see this a ton in the realm of like politics and political thinking, but it necessarily kind of overreaches into other parts of your life. And I just can't see how it's possible to really live a life where you're not optimistic and striving for the best, and instead focusing on the negative. And anyone who was around me when I was growing up will laugh because I used to be the glass half empty kid. But it just really, it's like there are so many greater points I could make, but to an extent, it just really baffles me that people feel so almost useless in a sense in their own lives. I don't know if that's the right way to put that, but that's kind of what it seems like to me.
You know, I think I noticed this because I'm a child of the 80s, and the 80s was the most optimistic era I can think. One of the most optimistic eras I can think of. I guess the 80s and the 90s too, if you count, you know, the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's this tremendous, you know, liberation. And, you know, I grew up with the fear that we were all going to die in a nuclear apocalypse tomorrow, and it literally, you know, it was not a hysteria. It could have happened at any moment. And then suddenly, poof, our big rival, the Soviet Union, sort of, you know, like a puffball suddenly disappears one day. And there was this tremendous sense of opportunity, of just the whole world being open, that I think is somewhat lost. And it does have this weird effect, you know, that people agonize over whether they should kill children into this terrible, horrible world, and deny themselves one of the greatest adventures you can go through in life, of raising children. And, you know, it's also the sense that, I think there's been a great diversion into politics of people's efforts and energy and concerns. People are just obsessed. More people are obsessed with politics, and people have observed that politics has taken the place of religion as a source of meaning and a source of identity, as something you identify with. I'm on the left, I'm on the right, this sort of source of tribal identity. And it's taken up so much bandwidth that ought to be going into art and innovation, and you know, we ought to be glued to the pages of the newspaper, looking at what the latest technological innovations are. And instead, you know, we're focused on the way to improve the world is through politics, and it's actually one of the least effective ways to improve the world. And by the way, I want to mention, this is not just, you know, kids on the left that I'm talking about here. It's also something that has really the apocalyptic approach, and also the substitution of politics as a source of meaning, has also taken over very much on the right. I view the sort of the Trump era less as a cause of this than as a symptom of it. That, you know, people on the right have, you know, the traditionalist types are basically saying, well, look, you know, religion's in decline, and so therefore all of our culture is coming crashing down. The woke people are taking over. We are literally in a totalitarian dictatorship, and it's an absurdity. We are not anywhere close to being in a totalitarian dictatorship. We are not anywhere close to having our ability to, you know, make a living and succeed in life cut off. But that apocalypticism came into the right as well, and has distorted that politics, and makes it seem like, you know, fighting the culture war and backing whoever the political champion is of the culture war right now, and being mad about the culture war, is the most important thing you can do to make the world better. And in fact, you know, going out and building new things and creating things and inventing things and living your life to the fullest is the best and most effective thing you can do to make the world better.
It's funny that you mentioned that politics is now like become this giant central part of people's lives, because to me that's like the opposite of liberalism and how I view liberalism. So let's go over some definitions. What is your definition of liberalism?
Right, liberalism is advocacy of a free society. I mean, it comes from the Latin word, literally Latin word for freedom. So it's the idea, in my view, the central idea of liberalism is that freedom should be the essential or the central value of a good, proper, you know, prosperous or ideal society. That, you know, we should organize our culture and especially our politics around the idea of freedom. Now, liberalism, of course, is a term that has taken on this wider meaning. I'm using it in the political philosopher's sense, right? Not in the partisan political sense. In the partisan political sense, it became identified in the 20th century with, the welfare state and with the sort of the left, although with the more old-fashioned left, right? So when I was a kid, the battle lines have changed on this. The definitions have changed. When I was a kid, a liberal was like, think George Carlin or something like that. There was somebody who was sort of pro-welfare state, wanted a large government role in regulating industry, but was, very pro-free speech, pro-individual liberty. And of course, that's a kind of an old-fashioned thing now, because that doesn't describe really today's left. It certainly doesn't describe the woke left, which has become much more about, let's have much more control over what people say, and you can't say this and you can't say that. And as my friend Lou Perez says, that joke isn't funny anymore. And it's much more about, you have to control the individual. The old-fashioned left liberal was someone who believed in individual freedom as an essential goal, just not in economics, right? And then the classical liberal which is where I stand, is the person who, this is the sort of the 19th century definition of what a liberal is, which is believing in freedom across the board, believing that individual rights is the foundation of a proper society, and that should apply to our economic lives and to our speech, to our personal lives, to our personal decisions. So sort of, John Locke to John Stuart Mill, that version of liberalism. And the biggest thing that I'm campaigning about, and this is the reason why I started Symposium, is I think this concept of what is liberalism got caught up in the sort of fake divisions of the so-called left-right divide in American politics, right? So you had, you're either left or right. And then what was left and what's right sort of evolve over time to have nothing to do with liberalism or anti-liberalism. There are people who I would describe as being essentially liberal who are on the center left and on the center right. There are people I would describe as being extremely illiberal who are on the left and the right. And so thinking of things in terms of left and right has always sort of obscured this more than it enlightened. And it does so especially now when the fundamental issue of liberalism versus illiberalism really, cuts across that left-right divide.
And we're going to get into that illiberalism and all of that. But so you mentioned that freedom and free society is the primary focus of liberalism, but are there any other principles or features that are necessary for the basis of American liberalism and a liberal society?
Well, yeah, I think there are definitely some things that are, I would say they're implicit in the concept of freedom or liberty, but they need to be pulled out explicitly, because if you don't have those, you will go off the rails. So one of those I would say is individualism, right? That freedom is individual freedom. That ultimately the person who is free, the entity that is being free, is always the individual. It's preventing the individual from, so where sort of the left liberalism of wokeness goes off the rails is in defining people in terms of groups, right? And so, politics should look at you as a member of, you're white or you're black, you're straight or you're queer, you're all these different sort of tribal dividing lines, racial, class, gender, et cetera, that we have dividing people. And then your rights or your interests as a group should be considered. Whereas, in the concept of freedom is I think is inherent in it is the idea that, you can be oppressed by, that freedom is the autonomy of the individual, your ability as an individual to make your own choices about what you want in life, how you're going to go about to do it, without, and not simply your membership in a group and your interests as a member of a group, because you are different from the other people of that group. You are not just, an interchangeable cog in some collective. And when you treat people like an interchangeable cog in some collective, then you end up downgrading that individual freedom and basically, substituting, the tyranny of one group for the tyranny of another. The second thing that I would say is inherent on this also is a regard for reason and persuasion. By reason, I mean, the use of arguments, of logic, of evidence to settle our differences and to resolve disputes. And that implies, the fact that people need to be left free to balance the evidence, to weigh the arguments, to make the arguments, including unpopular arguments, and then the freedom to consider that in their own mind without some other kind of coercion or other consideration being made more important than what do you think of the evidence? What do you think of the reasoning? And that's something I think is a huge cultural value. Because we talk about freedom of speech, we can talk about what's protected by the First Amendment, what's not protected by the First Amendment. But beyond that, I think there is legitimately there's a culture of free speech, which is a general attitude that, yes, a diversity of opinions and views is desirable, that people should not be, browbeaten and intimidated even by social pressure. Forget government pressure, even social pressure should not, within certain limits, should not browbeat and intimidate people into not raising uncomfortable questions or unpopular ideas. So we need to have that as a cultural value, that regard for reason, discussion, persuasion.
So what would you define as the biggest threat to liberal society today? And how do these threats compare to threats of the past? So on university campuses, there's the threat that about speech codes where there were the administrators were basically just imposing all these speech codes. And then you have now students who are demanding censorship, trigger warnings, stuff like that.
Yes, you've been talking to David French, I can tell, or at least reading him, because that's one thing he talks about how he spent, his early years as a free speech litigator going against, literal speech codes where the campus administrators would say, you can say this, you can't say that. And, basically litigating that in courts and saying, no, you can't impose this on the students, especially at public schools. And then what he discovered basically is we thought, okay, we can get rid of the administrators imposing this and everything will be fine. And then the students come along and impose this on their peers through social pressure and through, demanding people be fired, et cetera. And there's a case recently at college in Minnesota, I think, where an art history teacher showed, real paintings from the past, images of real paintings from the past, paintings created by Muslims showing Muhammad. And a Muslim student complained saying, oh, this is Islamophobia because certain versions of Islam, have prohibitions against depicting Muhammad. Now, she's presenting the actual facts of art history. She's presenting Muslim artists who depicted Muhammad who didn't subscribe to this. But the university administration immediately sort of caved in. Now they sort of tried to cave back, and there's this whole litigation going on it. But this is the sort of thing where the social pressure from the students themselves has sort of replaced the authority figures from the top down coming after people. And it's the authority figures who are actually caving into pressure from the students to do this, or at least from one student in this case. All right. So I do think that's a huge threat, but I think I'm going to be a little contrarian here. And I think the biggest issue is the biggest threat to liberalism is people accepting this left-right dichotomy. Because you'll also see that there's this new thing in Florida, I think it is, where there's been a series of laws passed on the state level by conservatives saying, controlling what books can be in student libraries at the schools and what can be taught at the schools. And, you can teach this and you can't teach that. And then going into the universities and saying, we're going to get rid of critical race theory and you can't promote critical race theory. And there's been this sort of conservative cancel culture that they've been adopting by saying, okay, Ron DeSantis is going to go in and tell you what you can teach and what you can't teach and what you can say and what you can't say in the schools. And so I see a lot of people who have been so programmed by, 30 years of political correctness, a lot of people my age, right, who grew up with political correctness, was what we called it in the 1990s, back before it became wokeness. They've been so programmed with that's the threat, and those are the people who want to control our speech, that they don't want to see a similar threat coming from the right and from the sort of nationalist, the very illiberal nationalist right that's coming up. That's basically saying, well, we're going to control speech just in favor of our preferred speech. And so I think the biggest problem is that people have to get that left-right dichotomy out of their mind and think not in terms of left or right, but in terms of, well, Ronald Reagan. So the speech that made Ronald Reagan nationally famous is 1964, the Time for Choosing speech. They called it a Time for Choosing. It's sort of what launched him onto the national scene. He was endorsing Goldwater, but he made a great point. He says, there is no left or right. There's just an up or down. Up to the maximum amount of freedom that's compatible with the rule of law, and down to totalitarianism, right? Down to illiberalism, down to the lack of freedom. And I think we need to really reorient our brains in that direction to say, okay, let's not think left or right. Let's think up or down. Let's think liberal or illiberal.
That actually, it's a striking response, but it makes a lot of sense because what a lot of people refer to as tribalism is really just this reliance on an institution that is not one of those fundamental to a liberal society, like church. Instead of church, it's politics or something. And so it's kind of interesting that like it really is this acceptance of the dichotomy. You're right.
It's one of those ideas that's kind of like it's like a fulcrum. It was an Archimedes who said, give me a lever and a place to stand that I can move the world. This is one of those mental levers where when you pull that lever and you start, or maybe like the duck versus bunny, the optical illusion, where when you flip this mental switch and you suddenly see things a different way, and suddenly the whole landscape looks different if you see it from this different perspective. And
I'd like to say it here. I don't know if I've said it on the podcast before, but about a year ago, I had this. I predicted that what was going to happen to the political spectrum is that the extremes, like the illiberal extremes, were going to converge. And that's kind of what it looks like now, and that the center was going to become something new, regardless of what side of this spectrum. So kind of the prediction had to do with this dichotomy kind of dissolving. So I just want to lay that out there for the future to see if I'm right. And I mean...
Well, yeah, I would say I've lived for decades. I have lived in terror that the left and the right would find how much they have in common and join forces. And there's precedent for this. That the communists going over to the join. In Weimar Germany, the 1930s, communists going over to join the Nazis was such a common phenomenon. They actually had an expression for it. They were called beefsteak Nazis, brown on the outside, red on the inside. They're brown shirts on the outside, but they were still red. They were still communists underneath. So this idea that the people would go back and forth from the communists to the fascists, you think, oh, but they're opposites, but they're really not. And so I've been in terror that those groups would, instead of fighting each other all the time, would actually realize how much they have in common and find some way to synthesize and join forces. But I think, in answer to, I think they are to some extent doing that now. And I think the answer, especially the nationalist conservatives, they actually take a lot of ideas from the left and from the illiberal portions of the left. So I think that in response, those of us who are liberal in our disposition, we have to maybe, downgrade or find ways to work with each other across what have been our traditional divisions, and people who would normally have argued with each other over the welfare state have to find ways to, not necessarily give up those arguments, but find alliances and find ways to reach out to each other in order to form our own synthesis, our own alliance. I call it neoclassical liberalism. Take neoliberalism and classical liberalism, find a way for them to work together, call it neoclassical liberalism. And I don't think it's the center. I think that thinking of ourselves as the center is part of the problem, right? Because what's the center in between? Well, it's between the extremes. And so you often see people who are moderates, quote unquote, moderates on the left, moderate Democrats. And when they think of themselves, they think of themselves as, well, I'm just a watered down or less extreme version of, the far left. Or if you're a moderate Republican, you're a watered down, less extreme version of, the far out nationalist right, Marjorie Taylor Greene or whoever you want to put there. It's the same problem that you think of yourself as just a watered down version of illiberalism. Well, instead of, I think we need to define ourselves not as moderates, are not as the center, but as we're the people who are up in Reagan's scheme. We're the people who want to go up to freedom, as opposed to the ones that want to go down towards illiberalism.
It's a nice, it's good that it's in a speech somewhere. Like, we can go read it, quote it. It exists, and we can just recycle this idea.
Well, in politics, as a rhetorical matter, in politics, there are certain people who had these huge impacts that had this residual element of goodwill. And so often talking with anybody who's on the right, and I mentioned, St. Ronald of Reagan. I mean, he has, and I remember, because I grew, like I said, I'm a child of the 80s. It was a great era to grow up in. He had this tremendous, optimistic sense of life that he conveyed. And his policies led to, a lot of great results, a booming economy, the collapse of the Soviet Union, this tremendous sense of optimism. So it's really good to be able to go back and say, look, we had this once. We had a leader who believed these things once, and look what the results were. And maybe we could try that again.
Yeah. Well, so I don't think it's a question of, obviously, we've kind of talked about this at length at this point, that the attacks on liberalism are coming from, quote unquote, both sides. They're basically coming from down, from illiberal. To put an example to this, when Donald Trump was running for office and threatening to rewrite libel laws to go after New York Times and Washington Post for writing things about him. And I remember thinking that was crazy. And, it's less crazy every day. It's more possible every day. So I guess, can you tell us what the differences are between the two types of illiberalism? Because I do think there are still some characteristics that they have that are distinctly different from one another.
All right. So this is something I've been teaching my kids, which is, I ask them, one of the most important things you have to understand is, what is the difference between communism and fascism? And they know the correct answer that I want now, which is, the difference between communism and fascism is the shape of the mustache of the guy who kills you. But the big bushy mustache, it's a communist. If it's a little tiny skinny mustache, it's a fascist. But there are stylistic differences and historical differences and sort of cultural differences between the illiberal left and the illiberal right. And I would describe it, but fundamentally I think it's ideological, which is it's that the right believes that basically that society should be organized around, well, they say around God or around religion, but they really mean is by tradition. They're a certain traditionalist understanding of that. So everything should be organized around tradition. And the left says everything should be organized around, they put basically the old line on that is they put society in the place of God. But they also think everything should be organized around progress, a version of society that's based on the idea of progress, which of course ends up being, the particular vision or progress of a small sort of clique of college educated people on what they think is progress, right? So, but the thing about it is even that seems unsatisfying, because the more you tear at it, the more you look at it in fundamental terms, the more you see the similarities. So I would say the similarity is they both believe the individual has to be subordinated to society. But and then the differences within that are stylistic. So, the right says it should be, the individual should be subordinated to the interests and views of society. And society means whatever was traditional when I was a kid. Right. It's a very much of a pattern. If you look at Trump, right, everything was always better back in 1973, whenever his heyday was, whatever he thinks as the way the world was better, everything should be like that again. And, and religion is the traditional outlook of things. So everything they should promote religion because that's the traditional source of meaning and value and ideas and morality. And then the left has stated everything should be organized around the interests of society, but society has traditionally been awful. It's been oppressive. It's guilty of all these crimes and sins. So society needs to be fundamentally restructured. And so that's the difference between them. But if they ever realize that, look, the insubordination of the individual to society is our common premise, and they could find more agreement on that, we'd be in trouble. But I think that the idea that that the fundamental the interests of the individual are the fundamental starting point, that society just simply is a group of individuals. There's no such thing as the good of society in contrast to the good of individuals. And if we focused on individual freedom and a focus on individualism, we would get, beyond that. But, so those differences are real between the left and the right, but they're stylistic.
So first, this is a really good point, because I spent my entire life growing up giving up on the idea of ever understanding the difference between communism and fascism, because I was convinced there was none and everyone around me was not convinced. And it just feels pretty vindicating. But so I guess, so there are similarities and there are differences, but that doesn't really stop them, all these illiberal groups, from accusing each other of being authoritarian and kind of clashing heads about this, like whether it's the right complaining about cancel culture and wokeism or the left complaining about Trump and this existential threat to liberalism. But they seem to be, I don't know, fighting each other in weird ways as if they're not really serious about it. Do you think that they will continue to fight with each other, and how?
Well, I think part of what goes on in our politics, too, is because things aren't defined in the most fundamental and illuminating terms. It's not defined in terms of freedom versus, liberalism versus illiberalism, freedom versus authoritarianism. Because of that, people substitute and get caught up on a lot of superficial issues. And also, like I said, politics has replaced religion, so it's become a source of tribal identity. So there's a lot of political battles you see these days, and especially in the culture war, that can be understood not as this is an important issue that really determines the course of society, but can be understood as this is a placeholder for us declaring our tribal identities against each other, right? And it's an excuse for us to line up and make everybody line up as you're on one side versus you're on the other, and to draw those sort of tribal battle lines. And so, for example, this latest one about gas cooking stoves, right? They're going to ban gas stoves. Now, this is briefly floated and then briefly abandoned. It's probably still out there. I'm sure we're going to be hearing about this for another 10 years. But I was amazed by the extent to which it immediately became part of the culture war. There was a gas stove culture war all of a sudden. And you had all these Republican politicians going out there and declaring they can have my gas stove when they pry it from my, I guess the cold dead fingers wouldn't work. It'd have to be warm fried fingers. And then you had a bunch of other people, saying, induction stoves are not the proper way to cook now. And if you have a gas stove, you're looked down upon because you're in the pocket of big propane or something. Or even like COVID. COVID is a great example of how immediately something that is a matter of science and epidemiology became swept up into, there's a COVID culture war. And, and people got very, how to put it, almost Victorian about how you have to take certain precautions. You have to wear masks and things like that on the one side. And on the other side, I'm not going to take any precautions at all because I'm not going to let them tell me what to do. And people took a not just a scientific issue, but one that with immediate, concrete life and death importance. And they just immediately automatically subsumed that into the culture war, and it became an excuse for me to state my tribal allegiance and to assert that against your tribal allegiance, and for us to have that kind of signifier, so that the empty culture war battle as tribal signifier is, I think, one of the signatures of the current era. It's always gone on to some extent. None of this is really 100% new. But I think what's new is the extent to which, the bread and butter issues, what we used to call the kitchen table issues, are less prominent in our politics, or to the extent they get mentioned, they tend to be sort of wrapped up into the culture war. Now, there are a couple exceptions to this that I find intriguing. And one of them, for example, is the YIMBY movement. right? So this is the idea that, people suddenly realize that, wait a minute, all these, the reason why young people can't afford a house if they're trying to buy it, especially in a big city, is because of all these restrictions and environmental restrictions and community input restrictions that are preventing anybody from building anything. So we should be out there saying, yes, people can build new apartment buildings. People can build new houses. And it's a weird thing because it's like a crusade against excessive regulation whose the people primarily doing it are people on the center left. So it's something that goes across. It's one of these things I'm looking for that are things that cut across the usual partisan lines. And also that instead of being around a fake culture war issue that probably has very little impact on most people, are actually about something substantive that would really make a difference. So I think we have a way out. We're seeing sort of dribbles of it, permitting reform and YIMBY versus NIMBY, yes in my backyard versus no not in my backyard. I think we're seeing some dribbles of how to get out of that.
You had a fascinating article over at Discourse Magazine called The Marriage of Liberalism and Democracy, where you explain that freedom and democracy sometimes seem to conflict, but that one can't survive without the other. Can you quickly make that case for us?
All right, so I'm a reformed. We're not a democracy. We're a republic guy. Who used to not like the, and it wasn't so much the phenomenon of democracy in the sense of voting and representative government. It was the word, and because there is where democracy goes wrong, and the analogy I use here is the democracy goes wrong is the death of Socrates, right? So you had this Athenian jury, and the juries in Athens were not just 12 people. There were like 500 people there. There were like mini legislatures convened to rule in a certain case. So this is the one of the hearts of Athenian democracy was this jury. And they voted to put Socrates to death, to execute him for asking uncomfortable questions and raising all sorts of philosophical questions about things that they thought ought to be unquestioned truths. And that's an example of democracy gone wrong, right? It's a group of people voting to put a guy to death just for asking questions. It's the democracy being used as mob rule, as the will of the people taking precedence over the rights of the individual. But I've softened on it because I've realized, two things. First of all, that the founding fathers, including the Jeffersonians, I think even Jefferson himself, used the term democracy in a positive way. So they use it to refer to what, a constitutionally limited republic. So if it's good enough for Thomas Jefferson, it's good for me. The other part about it is that the other story I use is that democracy also has a history as a protection against dictatorship. By putting power in the hands of the people, you prevent it from going to an elite or to an aristocracy or to some small cabal. And that is the real function of, that's the real sort of marriage between liberalism and democracy, between freedom and voting or representative government, is the idea that inherent in representative government, inherent in us voting for our leaders, is the idea that everyone has equal rights, that there's no one, born with superior rights, no one born with superior ability to dictate to us how we ought to live. And so therefore, the people ought to be consulted, that we ought to have, every one of us ought to have an equal say in how the government is administrated. And that ends up giving a tremendous protection for freedom against any small group or faction that wants to take away the freedom of the individual to do something. They have to face up against the possibility that the people have the ability to get them out of office. To if they overreach, if they become too oppressive, if they become too authoritarian. They can be voted out of office. They could be, new laws can be passed, new reforms can be passed that come up from the people and not just down from a central authority. So I think there's a tremendous need for voting for representative government, for the institutions of democracy, a liberal democracy. But at the same time, the whole trick of liberal democracy is both those words are important, right? You have to have the democracy is there to protect the people against a tyrant or a cabal or a junta or some minority of people who want to seize power. But at the same time, the system has to be designed as our founders designed it, to have protections for the rights of the majority of minorities and the individual against the majority. So the way I put it is, you have to be able to protect us from a tyrant the way democracy was originally meant to do in ancient Greece. But at the same time, you also have to protect protect Socrates from the majority, from the majority vote. So you have to have the protections for the individual as well. And the whole trick is, let's find a way to preserve and maintain that idea of liberal democracy.
So finally, I want to talk about your optimism for the future, if it exists, if you have a plan. And what we need to do, essentially, to fight against these illiberal means more than any specific side of the spectrum, the down, the illiberal. What do we do?
Yeah. Well, I'll say my plan is, specifically is to push on this idea I've been talking about how the left versus right, the traditional division there that's defined in non-essential terms, needs to be replaced with up versus down, liberal versus illiberal. And that, that sort of gestalt shift moment where you see things in that way and suddenly things look different. That's what I'm trying to push as a key sort of fulcrum to move people's minds and make a change here. I also think, though, what's been going on is that liberalism has suffered from a kind of philosophical or ideological neglect. That some of the key ideas and arguments that we've had over the centuries, people weren't paying enough attention to that. I think, there's a culture war that was fought and lost in the 90s that sort of fought and lost by both sides. That I think is interesting because back in the 1990s, when we talked about political correctness on campus, or really in the 80s, this is the heyday of this, there was this idea that, we need to preserve the great books education. We need to preserve the focus on the big ideas of Western civilization. And that was sort of if you were a conservative and you were fighting the culture war, your culture war was people need to be reading, Plato, and they need to be reading the great books and really have this base of knowledge and the ideas of Western civilization. And that's the war we have to fight. Well, that was sort of lost against political correctness and wokeness and the idea that, oh no, that's a whole bunch of dead white European males and we should decolonize them from our bookshelves and our curriculums and not pay attention to these big and important ideas. That's what happened on the left. But then in response to that, a lot of people on the right said, well, look, that culture war didn't work. So let's go to politics instead. Let's not talk about great big ideas and great books. Who cares about that? Let's talk about how we can, all get behind the latest populist demagogue and get as much political power for our side to use for what we don't really know. But, there's been this anti-intellectualism that's happened on both sides for their own different ideological reasons. And that's the big thing I'm fighting about is, we should be back discussing these big ideas and these big important questions and dealing with them on an ideological and philosophical level. And that's the other sort of big thing that I'm fighting for. But I am optimistic, though, because like I said, the world is way better today than it has ever been in all of human history. One of the things I fight against, too, is the idea that of fighting for Western civilization. I think that term is becoming obsolete because so many of these ideas and so many of the practices, including representative government, freedom of speech, have spread so far beyond, what we used to be called the quote unquote the West. I mean, the biggest fights for freedom have been in the last few years have been happening in like places like Hong Kong and Ukraine. Ukraine far, far, far into Eastern Europe. Hong Kong is not European. That's not Western at all. It's about as far east as you can go. That this whole sort of East versus West terminology is obsolete, and it's because these ideas have a universal value and meaning and have become universal and global. And so I think that's my source of optimism. Is that those ideas have spread, education and those fundamental ideas have spread much farther and much deeper across the world than I think they ever have in any era of human history before. I think we should not take them for granted and focus on them and make them the center of our thinking about politics and about society. But I think we have this tremendous reserve to draw upon for that.
Your optimism is contagious. I have one last question for you. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
We just talked about it, democracy. I used to be very much, that we're a republic. I was never in favor of dictatorship or anything like that. But I think the importance of voting and, it used to be because there's a whole history of 20th century, quote unquote, liberalism, the 20th century version of left liberalism, which was very much in favor of the idea that, well, we're a democracy, so therefore, whatever the public wants, it should get, right? Or the H.L. Mencken's old line about how democracy is the notion that the common person knows what he wants and deserves to get it good and hard. But whatever the people want, they should get, and the majority should rule and everything. And reacting against that in favor of a pro-freedom viewpoint sort of led me to downgrade the importance of voting and democratic institutions. And I think the events of the last 5 to 6 years, and especially, the January 6th riot at the Capitol, that kind of clarifies it. And because, democracy in that sense of the basics of voting and the fact that when somebody loses an election, he will voluntarily leave office, and the peaceful transition of power, all those things sort of were easy to take for granted because they weren't really in question. They weren't really under immediate threat. And the moment they become under immediate threat, you get a much more visceral idea of, wait a minute, now I understand how much this matters and how precious this is to me. So that's one of the reasons why I sort of changed in response to those events, that sort of awakened me to the fact that, yes, democracy in that sense of liberal democracy, that is more important. It is more vital. It is it should be given a higher level of priority than I had realized.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.